Good. Well, we're really pleased this afternoon to have with us Alan Padgett, who's come all the way from the States, and he's the professor of systematic theology at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's also currently on leave at the University of Notre Dame. And Alan has actually been very involved in the science-religion dialogue, and he's written a number of books. In fact, the book that we've got there on the bookstall, called The Science and the Study of God, a Mutuality Model for Theology and Science, is very close to his title for this afternoon, which is a Mutuality Model for Science and Religion. So do take a look at that book, and you've got your handouts. And without more ado, I'll hand over to Alan. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to meeting you and having conversation with you. My lecture today is basically trying to present a outline of a view I've been working on for a number of years that is about a rational basis for theology and science to influence each other, and also reasons why theology and science are similar in their reasoning or their rationality or their tradition of inquiry, and also why they're also distinct. So I have often found that the views I give are kind of new to people. It's not the view that people normally get either when they just study science or when they just study theology. So I typically like to have lots of time for conversation. So even if my talk doesn't take up all of the hour, I think we can still learn by discussing some of the ideas and working them through. And recently I'm a member of the Center for Theology and Natural Science in Berkeley, and I was out there with Bob Russell. And Bob has an incredibly, he's a physicist and a theologian, he has this incredibly intricate chart about all the different ways that different disciplines can influence each other. And so after I saw his chart, I made a very simple one. It's one of your handouts, and we can talk about that too. It came in your packet, but I'll have a slide about that too. So we've already heard some fine lectures from Professor Trigg about the rationality of theology and science, and I think we can review some of that. I'll also be talking about what I call dialectical realism and trying to explain that. It's not that different from critical realism, but I am more friendly to postmodern philosophy than is Professor Trigg. I think there's some important ideas and criticisms of rationalism, in particular Enlightenment rationalism, that we need to take on board. I'll talk about levels of explanation a little bit too, because that's important for looking at the way different disciplines influence each other. I'll talk quite a bit about worldviews. Not everyone is used to the concept of worldview. For some people it's a new idea, but it's really a pretty basic notion of a philosophy of life that includes whatever values, commitments, and larger understandings that guide our practice. So in this way, everyone has some kind of basic worldview, and they can be classified in different ways, because worldviews, like reason itself, I think, come to us in traditions. So we'll talk a bit about worldview and discuss the mutuality model. And I also think pure theory is not always all that great, so I tend to give an example. And by divine providence or human confusion, or maybe a little of both, it turns out that Dr. Wilkinson is going to be coming from Durham to talk about this exact subject. So I'm just going to briefly, lightly cover it, and he'll be giving you a lecture later in much more detail about issues of intelligent life on other planets. But for me, this is just an example of how theology and science can mutually interact and enrich each other. Well, I understand us to be working in a multi-religious context here at Faraday Institute at Cambridge. And so we have to define theology a little bit carefully, because not every religious tradition uses the word theology. Many of them would use instead the concept of philosophy. So a Buddhist would talk about a Buddhist philosophy. A Taoist might talk about Taoist philosophy. They probably wouldn't be comfortable with the word theology. But I'm going to just talk about theology as an academic, and the academic conceptual part of a religious tradition. And broadly speaking, I'm going to be talking mostly about the monotheistic traditions, whether those are Hindu or Western. But in such a context, we can state that theology seeks to know God and other things, that is, all things God has created, in relation to God. This is a little bit different from the concept of theology you sometimes get in religious studies, where theology studies the religious beliefs and practices of some tradition. The reason for that is I want to emphasize theology as a truth-seeking academic discipline. And it's interested in, of course, the beliefs and practices and history of the religion it's embedded in. That's clear. But that's not the fundamental goal. The fundamental goal is to understand the truth about ultimate reality, ultimate religious reality. So you might say then theology is the rational and conceptual aspect of a great world religious tradition. Now, it used to be possible to say that theology too is one of the sciences. But my own view is, if we were only speaking a different language, like say Latin, then we could say that theology is one of the scientia. Or in French or Greek or German, I think we could say that theology is a science. But I believe in contemporary 21st century English, anyway, science mostly means natural science. Now, I try to avoid that because I believe in the social sciences. A lot of people in religion and science don't consider them very much when they use the word science. But even if you broaden science to include the natural and the social sciences, theology is too different, I think, from the empirical research programs of any of the sciences to be considered a science. It is instead, I'll say, an academic discipline, a rigorous tradition of inquiry, grounded on spiritual truth and appealing to supernatural revelation, or in other traditions there would probably be talk about insight, wisdom, enlightenment that goes beyond the empirical and therefore appeals to things that go beyond what we normally think of as science in English today. And the other thing is, just like everyone has a worldview, so anyone who believes in a religious ultimate or has a religious worldview of some kind has a particular theology or a particular religious philosophy. And theology operates in many domains of our life. I'll talk about three here. One is that we live out our theology in our practices. There's a practical praxis of our theological beliefs, so that theology informs practice and practice inscribes theology. We also live out our theology in worship, preaching, liturgy, prayer, rituals, the different things that make religious movements, embodiments, language, particularly religious. Those all inscribe and embody various theological concepts. So theology is at work there too. But it's also true that theology is an academic discipline, a science in a very broad sense of something like the German Wissenschaft or the Latin scientia, where it's a rigorous quest to know something through reason and evidence and argument. And I do want to defend the rationality of science, especially against popularizers in science literature, many of whom use the word faith as if that meant believing against reason, believing against the evidence, believing things like believing 6 impossible things before breakfast or something like that. And that is not really what most people who are scholars of religion would understand faith to be. So I would say that I like comparing theology and science And then religious in all of its practical and vital elements, religion can be compared more to technology, which again is the practical, vital outworking of scientific ideas, describing certain scientific ideas in practice. So what's the relationship between theology and science? Well, a lot has been written on this. Dennis Alexander has a fine book on this that's on the book table, which I recommend. But so here again, we're just doing a quick overview. But I think that as with the different disciplines within natural and social science, so theology and science have aims and therefore methods that are distinct. So I want to start off with difference. There's a difference between theology and science. So even though I'm talking about mutuality and how they work together, there's important difference. If we think of theology, again, as the study of God and all things primarily in relation to God, most of my work has been in the natural science, so I'll talk about the natural sciences as the study of natural things, living and inorganic, according to natural properties and explanations. So physics studies matter and energy, chemistry studies molecules, biology studies the physical aspects of living organisms, and they draw on empirical evidence, natural explanation, laws and principles of nature. So in other words, there's a difference between theology and science that's important. Both can be rational, both can be based on evidence and argument, but there are important differences in the traditions of reason, what I call traditions of inquiry or academic disciplines, just another way of putting it. So when we think about science and theology and talk about the rationality of theology, sometimes people have a number of myths about science that I think we need to explode from the point of view of the philosophy of science in order to make some progress in talking about the mutuality of theology and science. The first myth I want to talk about is the myth of the given. Science deals with pure data. We just go out and we discover the data and we test our theories by the data, and it's just data and logic. And religion is sort of touchy-feely, or at best a kind of expression of a person's personal values. But I think a lot of work in philosophy of science has undermined the myth of the given. That data is assumption-laden, that we come to data with certain questions that come to us from tradition, that science is based on human interest, it's done by human beings, there's a social, historical, communal aspect to science. And closely related is the myth of neutrality. That scientific reasoning is perfectly neutral, it gives us this objective sort of view without any human interest involved. And lots of philosophy of science today, and I would agree with them, following Thomas Kuhn and other philosophers, have rejected the myth of neutrality. Human knowledge is shaped by human interest, and that's just as much true in solid-state physics as it is in, say, psychology or religious studies. And finally, I think because I want to talk about levels of explanation, I want to reject, again, just in the beginning here, the myth of a reductive atomism that says the smallest parts of something are the most important. So to analyze any phenomenon, whether in the natural world, the social world, the philosophical world, we want to divide it down to its simplest, most basic elements, the logical atoms, if you will, or real atoms. And this kind of reductive atomism, I think, has again and again proved both powerful but also limited. And I see in many fields a turn to a more holistic understanding of reality that I think is important. Now, these considerations do not lead to relativism, and I don't think we need to go into that too much because Professor Trigg's lecture has so well argued for what we call realism in science and theology. One thing he didn't mention, though, that I might point out is why not go with an anti-realist social constructive conception of truth? I mean, the truth is, the way we experience the world, the way we make sense of the world given our presuppositions and our social context. Well, I think the most important reason for that is even our most warranted, our best theories that based on the careful study of the phenomenon, reason and logic, those theories can still be wrong. And that's because as truth-seeking disciplines, both theology and science are getting at a reality that goes beyond just human phenomena, just human experience. But rather the experience of the phenomena are medium by which we want to get at something that goes beyond the human. Now, it's true that I don't think I want to confuse realism with either a sort of simple correspondence theory of truth or with sometimes criticized as a picture theory of meaning or a representational epistemology. I think you can get other kinds of realism besides that. But the realist impulse, I think, is a very important one. Our best theories can be wrong because reality is going to come back at us. We don't construct reality. There is a real world that's independent of the human mind and human community. Well, if you look at the types of realism in the science and theology discussion, the most common one in the literature is critical realism. That's the view that Professor Trigg has adopted, Professor Polkinghorne. It's an improvement over direct realism in its sort of simple. A direct realist would just say, what you see is what you get. The formula tell us exactly the way the world is. Our mathematical models mirror one-to-one what reality is like. And most people are philosophical enough to realize that's not quite going to work. On the other extreme, though, is various kinds of non-realism or anti-realism. For example, the instrumentalist view of Professor von Frossen, who's a prominent American philosopher of science. And on the non-realist view, of course, what we have are pragmatically interesting, useful theories that are kind of like instruments. They help us manipulate the world that we live in, but von Frossen gives up any realist conception of truth. I prefer, especially when I'm talking about science and religion, what I call a dialectical realism, which just takes critical realism one step farther. It's an advance, I think, on critical realism for a couple of reasons. One, critical realism tends to be about the individual. It really goes back to Kant. Kant called his philosophy the critical philosophy. And critical realism sometimes tends to be about the individual and the world and how the individual perceives the world. And I think that epistemology and traditions of inquiry are communal, they're dialogical, they're about learning together, which is another reason why I value conversation. I think that's important. Otherwise, why should we all fly here to be together? We could just work on the internet or something like that. The other thing is that Kantian epistemology especially, but critical realist epistemology tends to be passive and receptive. It's about how the mind receives impressions. And I think in a dialectical realism, I would like to also emphasize our interaction with reality and with other people as an important source of our knowing. And sometimes critical realist philosophy reads like it's a little bit atemporal. It's sort of like a snapshot of how I perceive the black cat on the white man or something. And really I think that rationality is tradition-based. I've come to believe that. We receive our differing rationalities through different traditions of inquiry. Although I would also agree there is a sort of a general there's sort of a family resemblance among the different ways that we think. You can still talk about general reason. Okay, so much for rationality then. This conception of rationality I'm developing, in other words, is leading toward it's kind of a prolegomena, a justification of this model I'm trying to develop. So here, these philosophical ideas are making it reasonable, or trying to get you to see that it is reasonable to say that a person's theology could influence their science. That's usually, most theologians agree that science influences theology. I mean, that's not the part that you have to work at. It's trying to convince people that it's reasonable to have our religious worldview influence our scientific thinking. So the next step then is to realize that in the sciences themselves there are levels of explanation where the different disciplines mutually influence each other in interesting ways. And that's already been gone over pretty well by a number of scholars, and I'll just go quickly over this idea. First of all, I want to say I'm talking here about levels of explanation, and I want to sharply distinguish that from levels of reality. I mean, I think there are also levels of reality, but those don't map one-to-one on our disciplines. Whereas levels of explanation are about the levels of the sciences, if you will, and how they interrelate. Now, the lower level, lower and higher is an unfortunate metaphor. I don't know how to get around it, but I'm not sure that the lower ones are worse, the higher ones are better. So if we could just delete that part and just recognize that some disciplines provide data for other disciplines, which they then use. So maybe I'll just go right to the examples. Physics provides data for chemistry, you know. In a way, chemistry can also influence physics, though. I mean, there can be some backward and forth there. So it's not all one way. And one of the examples of the back and forth is that the higher level sciences can create new insights and issues for lower levels to investigate. One example of that is genetics and ecology. I mean, you might think, if you're sort of a DNA reductivist, you know, sort of an atomistic type of thinker that some people have been, that, you know, okay, everything is in the DNA, everything is in your genes, you know, all of your behavior comes out of that. So then what could the environment have to do with that? Well, it turns out that your genes do respond to their environment. So that a fully orbed genetics is going to have to bring in some ecological concepts about the relationship between organisms and the larger environment to understand the way different specific organisms develop differently in different environments, even given the same basic genetic type. So there have been, and there continue to be, interesting connections between these different levels of the sciences. Biology influences psychology, for example, but the psychological questions can also influence the kinds of experiments that brain researchers may be doing. So there can be some two-way flow here. And I think that happens in theology too. That's my point. Theology is very, very far off from physics and chemistry, but there could maybe be some influences there that's not unnatural if you recognize there's levels of explanation already in the sciences. Anyway. Okay. Now, what about the different ways of reasoning in science and theology? I've talked about how they're different, and now I want to talk about a little bit how they're the same. If we think that it's rational for theology to influence science, then we better think that theology is more than just about our personal value, expressions of personal value. And theologians, I would argue, and religious philosophers are interested in the truth. And not just the truth from our point of view, I mean, but the truth for all people, although got at from a particular point of view. So theologians and scientists are truth-seeking communities. And all the disciplines build on specific presuppositions. They all accept data and theories from the past in certain traditions. And so it is true that physics is physics, whether it's done in New York or Beijing or Cambridge. And so sometimes scientists say, oh, well, look how multicultural we are in religions. You know, to be a theologian, you have to be attached to a particular faith, a particular religious truth. But the fact is that, you know, Christian theology is done in Jerusalem or in Beijing or in New York. It can be done in very much the same way. So theology can also be multicultural, it can be global. But the difference is that for the theologian, you are caught up much more fully in a whole range of values, in a whole range of faith beliefs. And the element of faith in most science, or presuppositions, allows many different kinds of religion and people with no religion at all to be involved in that discipline. So lots of different kinds of worldviews can be involved in doing, I don't know, sociology. That's not true of Christian theology. It's done within the Christian tradition. So there's a difference there. But still, I think that all the disciplines draw on specific traditions of inquiry, and they're different. You know, you don't have the same exact presuppositions in psychology that you do in chemistry about the nature of the world, or what counts as a good reasoning. And it seems to me that both theology and science need to be holistic disciplines. There should be dialectical. By that I mean you learn from, you know, discussion, dialogue, recognizing that whatever thesis we put forward, whatever, even our best theory, probably has some problems in it, that it's going to grow over time or maybe be revised, and recognize that any theory we have in theology is a human good work. It's not identical with divine revelation. You know, maybe it may appeal to revelation, but theology is done by humans, for humans, as a human good work, and it's always open to revision and to reason. Well, then what this suggests, I think, is not only levels of disciplines, but different relationship between theories and worldviews. And again, I want you to notice that the little arrows go back and forth. Sometimes people think you work directly from data right up to theories, but there's lots of interconnections. At the most basic level is theory choice in any discipline. And is which theory do we think best fits the data? Okay, great. But what happens when you have multiple theories that are all empirically equivalent? What happens if you have multiple theories that are not empirically equivalent in principle, but for all that we can do right now to test them, they're equivalent? You know, it turns out life on other planets is like that. I mean, they are not empirically equivalent. I'm not suggesting that. But not in principle. But as a matter of fact, right now, whether you think there's life on other planets or not, you get the same empirical results because we just haven't had any hard evidence one way or the other. So theory and theory choice, it turns out, is shaped by paradigms, and those come in particular academic disciplines or traditions of inquiry, and those in turn are shaped by worldviews. So the nice thing about the empirical sciences is lots of different worldviews can fund and participate in any specific discipline. And as I said before, anyone can do religious studies, but theology typically is done by people who are attached in some way to that worldview. And when we interpret the theories, we automatically then draw on our worldview. Because once we've got a theory choice, and then we start to interpret it to the broader public, we inevitably draw on whatever specific worldview the scientist brings or the scholar brings. Okay. Now, some people, I've been trying to say, you know, science is compatible with lots of different worldviews. Some people think science implies a certain worldview, a worldview called naturalism. So now I have to turn that idea to get more toward a mutuality of religion and science. Does science provide us with a complete worldview? I think the answer to that's got to be no. All of the sciences use epistemological and other values that they cannot prove. They just assume them. There is a worldview that is naturalistic, that is, that believes all there is natural objects, and we usually call that scientific materialism. But that is not a direct result of science. It's a combination of scientism, that is, belief that science and technology are going to give us all that we can know, that we're likely to ever have able to know, and are going to solve what problems that actually can be solved, combined with either materialism or naturalism or a philosophy or metaphysics that says all there is natural things. So that naturalism is not the result of science. I don't even like to use the word methodological naturalism, which didn't exist, by the way, until 1976, because it gives away too much to naturalism. I say that all the disciplines have an explanatory focus and a background. The natural sciences are toward nature, but the social sciences are toward human. They're not naturalistic, they're humanistic. And theology is philosophical and toward ultimate spiritual reality. I also think that religion has a part to play. Not only do I think that religion should be reasonable, it does seem to me there's a mutuality in that religion can influence reason. And this goes back to the question that came up earlier today, what is reason? I mean, if reasoning is the way human beings go about coming to conclusions based on arguments, evidence, and the logical connection between truths, then it's going to be the case that our worldviews will inevitably influence our reasoning. So to talk about the religious redemption of reason is to say that since reason isn't neutral, if there are ultimate moral truths, ultimate spiritual truths, we want our reasoning to be oriented toward those. Not in a way that destroys reason, but in a way that fulfills it. And so to talk about the redemption of reason means, I think, in part, to reorient reason to its proper end or goal, that is, to that spiritual truth which is the ultimate reality. If you're a Buddhist, you think it's nothingness. Okay, so you want to orient your reasoning toward that ultimate spiritual truth. And also to give reasoning a ground, a moral ground, a spiritual ground that goes beyond what pure rationality and the ideal, the dream, the myth of the Enlightenment was seeking. To recognize that reason can be given, as it were, a godly basis. And what this suggests then is that the various religions need to develop rational and scientific worldviews. The Christians to develop a Christian worldview, Muslims to develop a Muslim worldview, Buddhists to develop Buddhist worldviews. And that reasoning in these may be a little bit different. We may be able to agree on lots of things, especially if they're objective, empirical, rational, logical, but there may be other areas of reality, especially theology and morality, where our reasoning about things are going to be different. I don't think that's irrational. I think that's a natural result of the fact that reason is going to be influenced by these deeper presuppositions and values, that reason is not a purely neutral instrument. Reason is never purely neutral. We're almost there to the little chart. So it turns out then that scholars in these different disciplines really need each other if we're going to collaborate in developing religious worldviews that are also scientific. The easy one is the theologians, so I'll go there first. The theologians need faithful scholarship that interprets all the stuff that's happening in the sciences from the point of view of that religious tradition. An example I like is there's a beautiful big book on neurobiology called Zen and the Mind by, I think it's James White. Does anybody know that book? Do you know that book, Dennis? Zen and the Mind? It's a great book about meditation and religion and a lot of the work that's being done in neurobiology about meditation and spirituality and what is the soul and things like that. So the people that want to create a Buddhist worldview that's also scientific, they need scholars like that are aware of the science and that interpret it in that domain or in that tradition or in that worldview. I'm a Christian myself. I suppose that's not too surprising since I teach at Luther Seminary. But depending on how skeptical you are about theologians, I know some people who think it's probably better if you're an atheist in order to teach theology and be a little more objective.
Depends on which seminary.
Yeah, it depends on which seminary. Yeah, you wouldn't last long at Dallas Seminary, would you, James? So I also tend to think, though, that if a person is a serious believer in the arts or sciences, in the other academic disciplines, they're going to need some theological ideas when they seek that integrative wholeness, which I think all the great world religions really are seeking. I was a Taoist before I was a Christian, and I've always liked that idea of the great harmony of all things, however disparate they may seem. And I do think that's a spiritual value that most of the world religions seek, some kind of overall harmony, even if it's just for me personally, for my own religious quest and spiritual wisdom and insight. So people that are in chemistry need some theological ideas to help them say, well, what is this really saying, what I'm discovering here and doing here? what's the value of that from a religious point of view? And are there ethical and moral constraints on what kinds of experiments we do, or how we use our scientific knowledge technologically? I mean, these are things which I think the working scientists will also need. And this is a topic which will come up again in our time together, so I won't speak about that too much longer. But so I am about mutuality, I'm about collegiality. In the Middle Ages, the basic working metaphor was that theology was the queen of the sciences, and the other disciplines were anciliae, they were handmaidens, they were ancillary. And that hierarchical view, I think, needs to give way to a collegial metaphor in which theology and science influence each other. So this is a redoing of basically that earlier slide, talking about presuppositions, data, theory, choice, and interpretation. And notice how the arrows go both ways. You don't go straight from data to theory choice. Sometimes your theory helps you investigate the data and discover new data through experiment. So the theory says there ought to be neutrinos. Well, let's go build these super colliders and see if there are these dang neutrinos, or if it's just something that Pauli decided was important because of his equations. So there's a two-way relationship here between interpretation, theory, choice, data, presuppositions. But the way where I think theology and the sciences influence each other is at the level of interpretation. So whenever I'm interpreting the results of my scientific expertise, which I don't have any, right? I'm not really a scientist. I just pretend to be one on TV. But that you draw on these larger interpretations and larger presuppositions. So I think it's perfectly reasonable and normal if we think we have truth in one area, even if it's a spiritual truth, a moral truth, that may shape how we interpret and read and understand our scientific discipline. But there's one-way arrow, and only one on my chart. And that is that the interpretation of science provides data for theology, and not the other way around. So that the theologian needs to know what's going on in theology, but only at a very general, broad level of what's happening in the sciences. And then that becomes evidence for theology. Now, it may be secondary evidence or even tertiary. Often theologians are concerned about holy writings and scriptures and the traditional doctrines of a religion. But the science then can help us interpret and understand those too for the 21st century. And I don't know any intellectual religion scholar who doesn't think that's important. That the meaning and relevance of our religion needs to be done in the context of a world that's more and more dominated by science and technology. And so the natural and social sciences provide some evidence, some data, properly interpreted, of course. I mean, it's not, I don't know anything about any of the sciences in any detail. So I really need that sort of popular, interpretive, what's going on kind of articles that you get in Scientific American and so forth, in order to understand what's happening. But then I, as a theologian, can see, well, how is that relevant for theology? How do we receive that and interpret it? But I also think that theology can work in the sciences at the level of presuppositions and at the level of interpretation. Professor Triggs already talked about how, as a matter of historical contingent fact, in the West, monotheistic worldview was an important presupposition for the development of early modern science. And in fact of natural philosophy before that in the Middle Ages. That was in some ways the mother of early modern science. So at the level of presuppositions and interpretation, theology can interpret science. And because interpretation can shape theory choice can shape the quest for our data, then theology can rationally influence even the doing of science when, well, in an appropriate way, in a sort of very large frame, large canvas sort of way, not in any specific data, but in the sort of way that large-scale interpretations and paradigm often shape the quest for understanding. I'm going to give you an example of this now. So, But maybe I'll just ask, I know, okay, we got 10 minutes. So hold on to this. If you have questions about this, then when the lecture's over, then please ask them about this slide. Okay, my focused example is about religion and astrobiology. It's an example of the mutuality of theology and science. And since we do have another whole full lecture on this, I'm going to go over this very quickly here, these last few slides. But it has to do with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and as you're all aware, no doubt, there hasn't yet turned up any evidence for this, even when we've gone to other planets with robots and so forth, looking for signs of life, even the most primitive life. We haven't been able to find it yet. But the larger question, is there life on other planets, is an important one for our world. And broadly, we might say there's a couple of ways of interpreting this, right? One is a very stoic sense where we on planet Earth are alone in the cold, dark, deep and long, vast swirl of meaningless matter and time. And our lives are special because they are totally random. And you know, who knows if they'll ever come again. But we're basically the product of a universe that doesn't care one way or another whether we live or die. It's just a sheer accident that the cosmos has, as it were, burped up the human race. On the another way of looking at the same data, though, is that the universe might be bio-friendly. That is, perhaps life is not as strange and unreasonable and uncharacteristic of the universe as we know it as some scientists interpret, at least in their popular books and articles. Maybe it could even be that the universe has a purpose to bring forth life in vast array. Of course, the universe have a lot, maybe have even more purposes than that, I don't know, but that, is it impossible that that may even be part of the purpose of the universe? Now you can see what we're doing here is not just looking at the sheer data, but we're interpreting the data, we're interpreting the science. Now, one of those who very stoic scientists is the famous physicist Steven Weinberg. You may have read some of his books or articles or interviews. He won the Nobel Prize in 1979. He's a well-known physicist and author. And he's written on religious themes. Probably his best-known book is The First 3 Minutes. And perhaps the most famous sentence from that book is, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. You see what I'm talking about? That sort of stoic sense that it's just random chance and the sheer wandering around of chemical possibilities that brought life and finally intelligence into being. Not as many people have read his a little bit more theological book called Dreams of a Final Theory. And there he brings in the God hypothesis, talking about laws of nature in the beginning of the universe. And he says this, the more we refine our understanding of God to make the concept plausible, the more it seems pointless. So even any kind of God that would make a world like this is a pointless God, is what he's trying to say. And that interpretation is consistent with all we know about the science. It's consistent with it. There's no empirical test I know of to prove whether this view or a bio-friendly view is correct. These are different philosophical understandings of the data. And people that are religious, I'm going to suggest, would probably tend to a different interpretation, a different theory. When we look at things like fine-tuning arguments from cosmology, where the universe appears to be pre-programmed for life, and especially among biologists when we discovered life on Earth, on our little rock here, this teeny little planet we live on, in very extreme conditions. I mean, they bored down through the deep ice of Antarctica and found teeny little microbes at work in places where they didn't expect to find other life. Equally striking was miles below the ocean surface, far from any light from the sun, which we would have, I mean, when I was in school, I was taught, you know, when there's no light, there's no oxygen, there's no water, there can be no life. You got to have the sun. But here they found these, in the high pressure bottom of the ocean, these black smokers where the energy comes up through fissures of the earth, and they found life down there too. We probably, oh, I watched that on TV or so, whatever. But it was really striking and weird and unusual to biologists to find life down there. They didn't expect it. So if life can exist in these extreme conditions, then maybe life may exist in various forms throughout the universe. Maybe that's a possibility. And scientists like Christian de Duve and also Freeman Dyson have argued for a more bio-friendly understanding of the same universe, same data, same astronomy, same chemistry, same biology, but interpreting it in a way that makes life not pointless or meaningless, but maybe one of the things that the universe does naturally. Well, what are some of the theological implications if we take a bio-friendly view? So what I'm arguing is, on the one hand, our religious perspectives may want us to tend toward this view, and I personally, as a theologian, believe that's the case. I'm not saying that all theology would fall apart if Weinberg's view was right. Well, about pointless God it would, but that we're the only life in the universe, let's say. I'm not saying all theology would fall apart. But I would just say that you would think that the God of earth that we know on earth you'd be able to find some purpose to the universe. It wouldn't just be all chance. It would appear to be just chance. But if we do assume there's intelligent life on other planets, what does this mean for theology? So now we're talking about that to and fro area. How does theology deal with that? Well, unlike some in the religion science dialogue, notably Arthur Peacock of blessed and late memory, I don't think we have to give up the core religious traditions, whatever they may be. In other words, whatever their great world religion we're talking about. And again, Professor Trigg said, well, there's lots of different religions, some good, some bad, some local, some world. I'm here talking about the main world religions, that have existed a long time, encountered lots of cultures, had loads of philosophical literature written by and about them. Those traditions, I don't think, have to give up their core beliefs. For example, in Christianity, I see no reason to give up a biblical Christology or a real incarnation. This contrasts with Dr. Peacock, who thought that if life existed on other planets, this would radically alter our traditional Christian paradigms, including the significance of Jesus Christ. Well, maybe he's right. Theologians need to think about that. And as I said, theology is an ongoing activity. There may be more or less well-received results. At Luther Seminary, for example, we really think that justification by faith is probably a very good idea. That's not going to be revised in the future. But
Or you change your name.
Yeah, we'd have to change our name. But even that is up for discussion. And so it's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think we need it. I don't see the immediate need for it. What do we need then? Well, what I think we need is a larger religious imagination. And a deepening of our faith to recognize that God's bigger than, that whatever science discovers is going to be compatible with the true God of the universe. We may have to rethink our interpretation of certain holy writings or sacred texts, but the God of our scriptures can still be the God of the universe. Christians, again, will insist that the Blessed Trinity is the one true God of all the cosmos, even if intelligent beings on another planet have never heard of the Trinity or Jesus or the Holy Spirit. But that whatever God they know will still be the triune God, that there's going to be identity there. And if you think ultimate reality is nothingness, then whatever religious experiences the intelligent beings have on other planets, that will still be true there also. So the God of all, I need to wind down here, but the basic point is that the God that we know through the religious traditions of our planet, those religious traditions, because they were written specifically by earthlings for Earth, if you know what I'm saying, will need to be developed in new ways, but the core traditions could survive and maybe even be enriched by a discovery of intelligent life on other planets. It doesn't mean radically revising our theology. After all, the universe we've discovered is big. It's very, very big. But size is not going to matter to an infinite being, unbounded being. I mean, any universe will be equally small and finite, however big it seems to us. And the amount of time doesn't matter for God either, if God is eternal, as I believe. And could it be that a single child is more valuable spiritually and morally than an entire supernova? I mean, something can be very interesting scientifically and huge, right, gigantic. But it doesn't mean that on the scale of spiritual values, it's huge. So just because something is really, really big doesn't mean it's the most important thing that there is. It's very hard for Americans to realize that this is true. Especially ones from Texas.
Oh yeah, Texas size.
No. You're being recorded. You don't want that. So, it seems to me that God is going to relate differently to different beings because God is free and creative. But whatever values we understand about God are still going to apply. So this then brings me back finally to the mutuality thing. That on the one hand, if we think about astrobiology, I've argued that religious faiths tend us toward reading the astronomical data in a bio-friendly way. And I'm open to debate about that, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to discuss that. It's very speculative anyway. It's not like we have any actual empirical results. But I also think that astrobiology provides a challenge to traditional theologies, but that theology can and should meet this challenge with a deepened faith and an enlarged imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A great overview. So it's open now to discussion and questions, and over to you. Yes,
could I just from the point of view of clarification, just to link up with this morning, you were a bit more in favour of postmodernism than I was, and I mean, part of that may be that you think that reason is more rooted in tradition than I,
yes.
But I wonder if part of it is that we might be just meaning something different by postmodernism, or even by modernity. And I just wonder, I mean, it may be that we're not really disagreeing with each other as much as what you said may indicate.
That's good. I just finished writing an overview of 20th century philosophy, and the section on Heidegger was, okay, that was the hardest. But the section on postmodernism was the second hardest. So what is postmodernism is a huge debate in continental philosophy. I tend to favor those who see it not as a temporal difference, but as a space within modernity that's critical of some of the assumptions of modernity, especially assumptions about ungrounded rationality, self-justifying rationality, and a self that, whether through experience or feelings or reason, that there's some sort of transcendental ego, to use Kant's word again, that can then ground these great systems of thought, the Cartesian cogito. I find the postmodern philosophy, I don't know about culture and novels and art, I mean, but in philosophy, it's just a critique. It's just an attempt to critique that and do something different.
Although even that reference to the self, that Nietzsche was against the self because he was against God, and he saw the two as being correlative. And I wonder if a notion of the self isn't itself something of a religious view. I mean, I would have thought it quite important that I think I'm me, that I have.
That's fine.
Yes,
that's fine. But of course, the transcendental ego is a lot more than that.
Yes. Well,
I mean, it's the unity, the apperceptive unity of all phenomenal consciousness of the world and all these other things that might be too much. In other words, we don't want to place too much weight philosophically on some kind of absolute self. I think that might be a mistake.
Yes. I mean, and
I believe in the self. You want the self, of course, but I like Kierkegaard better than Nietzsche as far as precursor to postmodernism. I would prefer Kierkegaard to Nietzsche. They're both equally critical of Hegel, but Kierkegaard has a much greater appreciation of the power of faith and the need for God in human existence.
And then there's just the question about what you mean by modernity, and if you're looking to the 18th century, and I think to some extent I prefer the 17th century, which wasn't cutting out God. And so the early Enlightenment would see reason and God together rather than against each other.
I agree with you on that. I think it's really the pretensions of the Enlightenment that we're talking about, that rationalism.
Well, I'd be with you on that, Susie.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about reasoning today, and
Yeah.
I'm focusing in on a particular panel you have, the religious redemption of reason, and you mentioned the two ways to do that,
Yes.
and they seem to be, they make sense to me, but as I was reflecting, I'm a little bit self-generated, and I'm wondering about the role of grace.
So,
Do you see reasoning as kind of a completely flawless process, and where does the incorporation of grace come in?
well, actually that panel is a little bit it's quite controversial because I talk about the redemption of reason. And that implies the act of grace, doesn't it? So I mean, if you think about in Christian terms, grace is the activity of the Holy Spirit in redeeming the individual, the community, and creation. Or at least that's one way of defining grace. That's the way I would define it. So when we're talking about redeeming reason, we are talking about an act of grace.
Did you want to come back on that, or is it?
No,
that's okay.
I just
Yep,
wanted to-
yep,
yeah,
okay.
give a
Just
response.
want to
Thank
flag
you.
it up. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to carry on with that same slide. You say you want to reorientate reason to its proper end or goal as part of this redemption.
Yes.
So what exactly do you mean by that? What is this goal?
God.
And how do you
In the
justify?
Christian tradition, it would be the Blessed Trinity. Jesus Christ as the incarnate Logos.
How do you justify setting that as your end goal of reason? If reason is meant to be A implies B implies C, how do you then say, and at the end I wanted to imply God, and I'm
No,
going to fix it to
I'm a
get there?
firm believer in inductive reasoning. And I think deductive reasoning is an extreme case where there's very little epistemological value going on, although there's a little. But most of the reasoning in the sciences is inductive, or I prefer the word informal. So A implies B implies C is formal logic. But most of our reasoning about the world is informal. And there's a lot of values, epistemological values, other kinds of values involved in that. I think that I would justify orienting reason toward an ultimate spiritual goal. For me, Jesus Christ, the incarnation of the Logos, God, the Word of God, rational. Because I don't think reason is neutral in the way that many people think pure logic is, and I might agree with you on that. But the broader canvas of what counts as reason is not purely neutral.
Okay, so you're basically saying there's a difference between pure logic and reason.
Yeah, big difference. One is just a tiny part of the other. There's a difference between your carburetor and your car.
Yes, Dennis.
So, what I wrote in understanding, then we talk about this type of reason, we actually have to understand it in a sort of sense that Habermas uses, sort of communicative reason,
Right.
in that sense, as opposed to rationality in a Cartesian sense, or am I
Or
wrong
in a
there?
Weberian sense.
All right.
Maybe not everyone is aware of the debate between Jürgen Habermas and Max Weber
Tell
on
it to
this.
us.
Basically, Habermas is the greatest living German theologian, I would say, anyway, most influential since the death of Gadamer, anyway. Anyone else going to disagree with that? Go ahead, tell me if I'm wrong. But
Theologian.
he's a philosopher. Did I say theologian?
You did.
Oop, I meant philosopher. Sorry, thank you. See, I got something wrong there. No, he's a great philosopher, but his key idea about rationality is that the end or goal of reasoning is an ideal situation of communication which is free of ideology, free of manipulation, free of all those things that get in the way of true reasoning and communication. And so his argument is that reason is always itself value-laden, and that through this ideal of an ideal communicative situation and community, you can understand what those regulative ideals are. And this is over against people like Marx and Weber and others in the 19th century who thought that reasoning was always influenced by ideologies, or, that's in Marx's case, or in Weber's case, that the best reasoning was always purely neutral. Value-free is the word that Weber used, wertfrei. So Habermas is arguing against both of them, that genuine human reasoning is value-laden, and we can understand this through these ideal categories. So honesty, for example, is a very important value for him. Disingenuousness, wanting to communicate and to, not through political oppression or manipulation, but through reason itself to persuade the audience or your colleagues. Things like that. So I think he's right. But I would just see that as an intermediate step. So that as a Christian, I think those values have a even deeper spiritual grounding in who God is and who Christ is. So I wouldn't disagree with that, with Habermas on that. But as a Christian theologian, again, I would give a Christian interpretation and deepen that orientation.
So there's Habermas. I mean, if you read the things he's been saying lately, he's going more and more towards actually Christianity. I mean, in the meeting with the Pope, he said actually all of modernity is Christian and everything else is postmodern nonsense, actually. So he's moving in that direction as well these days.
I'm not sure I agree with that, actually, though. But it's nice to see these moving in a Christian direction. But the idea of Christianity is modernism and postmodernism is nonsense. I'm not sure I can buy that. He is a trenchant critique of the excesses of postmodernism, isn't he?
Yes.
Yes, that's a question about what about SETI? You have statements that, are we alone in the cold, dark, and vast world of meaningless matter and time?
That's rhetoric.
Actually, I try to quote from my memory. It's John Barrow's Templeton Award lecture. He said, "Yeah, the universe is big and old, dark and cold. The age of the universe is about 13.7 billion years.
Yeah.
But isn't that big? It's what he said is an economical size. What we think, probably each galaxy was 10 to 11 to 12 stars, and then we have about 10 to 11 or 12 that many galaxies. So we do need to have such a size so that we can accumulate enough heavy elements. If we have a universe only a size on, say, our own galaxy, that would be probably a few, I would say, million years old. And you won't have a second generation of a superstar, supernova, to generate enough heavy elements to build a life like us.
Right. I agree with that.
So the universe is big, it's cold, it's dark and old, but it's economical size. So it's only one planet like Earth.
Yeah.
I would like to run this input to it.
I think that we're going to hear more about this later, perhaps, in our course together. But I agree with that. I was just saying that he's given those scientific data for a purpose, isn't he? I mean, he's trying to argue for this fine-tuning idea that the universe has a purpose.
I'm
So
not sure
really
he's a
trying to
Christian or
interpret
not. I don't know if he's a Christian or not, but
Yeah, he is.
his argument seems to be
Yeah,
both
I know
Christianity.
Who was it?
John Barrow.
John
Oh,
Barrow.
John Barrow.
Barrow's in Cambridge,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
He's a
Yeah.
they know.
He's a
Yes.
Christian.
Although he doesn't make that explicit. I mean, he's trying to give a generic interpretation,
Yeah.
but
It's not a-
it's consistent with what I was arguing about the biofriendly universe.
But that argument was summed up in a way by something John Wheeler, the physicist, once said to me. He said, "Why is the universe so big? Because we're here. Because we couldn't be here in a small universe."
Well, that's a weak anthropic
Oh,
principle.
quite. Well,
That's-
that's
right.
exactly, yes, but that's the same argument.
Well, but that's convenience. Okay, there's a meaningless well here because we can observe that, so that's why we're here. But maybe there's a deeper meaning in there. It's convenience, they just ruled it out. So, okay, we don't want to care.
Oh, no,
Right.
Question? Okay, yes.
Yes, on your evangelizing ET and religion and imagination, didn't C.S. Lewis have this all worked out in his Space trilogy? With
It's a good try. I'm sure it all worked out for what I would use. But the other one to read is by Mary. I'm losing her name, but she wrote that. Russell, yes, Mary Russell, The Sparrow. So that novelists have done this better than theologians, I think, in terms of enlarging the imagination of what it would be like, religiously speaking, to encounter intelligent things on the planet. But Lewis is another good example, his Space trilogy.
Well, it's nice that he had a pre-incarnate world as well as a post-incarnate world.
And then he had that third book, which is terrible. That hideous book, I think, is the title.
That's about Cambridge College.
Yeah. That must be why it's so bad.
Let's not go there. I mean, it might be, if I just make a comment, it might be not dissimilar to encountering, let's say, Neanderthals, you know, if you're able to revive Neanderthals. I mean, in a sense, it might be that sense of the sameness and yet the otherness, which we might go through in our experience. Should we suddenly find a little tribe of Neanderthals that never did get wiped out? You know, that sort of idea, isn't it? So I think you're right. Yes, other questions? Yeah.
Actually, I think that some of them are running Oxford colleges, aren't they?
Right. Any other questions and discussion? Okay, yes. Yeah.
Just a question, I don't know if this is implicit in your theme, but if I were to use reasoning, are you saying eventually, is it kind of an optional thing whether I take a religious or a non-religious point of view, and from that point forward, you know, live accordingly, or would reason in your mind and according to the presentation you've made maybe lead you to a certain orientation?
I think both of those are true. Reasoning could lead you to a certain orientation, which then shaped everything you think about reason. But I certainly think there is, let's just say, a better or worse ends or goals toward and values which can inform our reasoning. And certainly I'm committed to the Christian faith, although I've been talking mostly just about religious worldviews. But it's also true that, you know, reason can work well when the values come from more ordinary worldly things like communication. To go back to Jürgen Habermas, I think you're going to need some kind of value system though to make. Pure rationality has not always been a positive experience for the human race. The attempt to have just absolutely pure logical often has been very damaging. So I think you do need some, but it's compatible with many different philosophies, including atheistic ones.
I guess I'm asking as a follow-up to the previous question on grace, that if life's kind of a crapshoot in terms of what philosophy you choose. I mean, I get questions from my kids that say, you know, why didn't God make it more obvious? There's the old C.S. Lewis quote. C.S. Lewis quote said, God's not the cosmic rapist, but he does provide enough evidence there if you make the choice and effort over a period of time to find your way, because otherwise we're left in a world, hopefully if we have a loving God, who we're left with uncertainty, which breeds a certain restlessness, which is not spiritually healthy, I don't think.
That's a very deep theological question, because it raises the issue of why has God created a world in which intelligent beings come to be but don't realize that there is a God. Why isn't God's existence more obvious? Immediately obvious. And I don't know that I have an absolute, easy, standard view that everyone could agree with on this, in whether Christian theology or philosophy. But I will just share with you what I tend to think, which is that God values the relative adulthood and maturity of the beings that evolve intelligence and moral awareness. And that, I'll say something more than that, maybe we wouldn't evolve moral awareness, intelligence, and autonomy if God were far more obviously involved in creation. It's at least a possibility. I don't know if I believe it, but I'm attracted to it as an idea.
Yes.
just carrying on with this again, do you then believe that there is such a thing as absolute reason? Because if there is, and it leads to God, then we're left with that idea that there's no place for grace or Christian belief. And if it leads to something that isn't God, in a Christian sense, then the whole of Christianity is left with that problem. And it kind of leaves you thinking, well, maybe reason there has to be a choice in reason, and that choice, a Christian at least will see as faith. So would you think there is absolute reason?
Yeah, no, I tried to argue that there's no purely neutral reason, which I think is similar to what you're saying is absolute reason. But that reasoning is all, human reasoning done by humans is directed by human interests and grounded in values that can't be proved just on the basis of logic alone and so forth. So no, I don't think I'm not even sure what the word absolute reason would mean, but it doesn't sound like, I don't think I like it, whatever it is.
Roger, do you want to come in on that thing, absolute reason? Do you have a term in your vocabulary which would be absolute reason?
I just don't, no, I wouldn't use that term, but I just don't like that there's the way in which reason is somehow separated off from value and is neutral, because reason should be centered on the truth. And if the world is not, I mean, I don't think reality is value neutral if it's created by God. It isn't value neutral in the way empiricists would have us believe. There are facts, and then there's our reaction to the facts.
That's what I'm responding to.
Yes, but to a theist, the world isn't like that anyway. So reason shouldn't be like that. Reason should be reacting to a world that, well, to say it's shot through with value is still to keep that distinction, but to a world that's has purpose and direction and worth built into it.
Yes, I quite agree.
Okay. Anything else want to have questions? Yes.
Yeah, so you said that worldviews, they influence our interests, and then according to our interests, we, I don't know, do different things. I don't know.
Different theory choices.
Different theory choices, yes. But okay, so our interests, in a certain sense, what are we interested in or what we want to achieve? And in that sense, the path from worldview to theory and what we do to prove this theory is rational. But is the way that we develop a worldview rational? I mean, how do we develop or accept a worldview? You know?
I think we inherit our worldview from our world. In this, we're embedded in the world, in our social world. We learn it with like language and morality and how to walk. It comes from our original situation. Right.
Psychological sources.
And then liberal arts learning is meant to help us develop those in rational ways in response to the truth, in response to the opening up of our minds toward newer ideas. So we don't just inherit a worldview, but we also develop it and grow it. And I think all the academic disciplines, including the arts and humanities, have something to contribute to that. But I sense maybe it's not all of what you're talking about. I don't think we choose our worldviews, by the way. I think that's far too simple a way of talking about it. I think we find ourselves already with these views, with these values, with these conceptions. And what we do is we kind of wander around with them.
Does reasoning have anything to do with it?
Yes, I think it does. I like that metaphor from the Cambridge Platonists of the candle of the Lord. It may be just a very small candle, but there is some light there that can guide us. And I do think that theories are more or less adequate. They're not all equally good just because maybe they all work fine. It doesn't make them all equally true. And I think that one of the big jobs that philosophy does is to look at these various perspectives, compare them, look at their implications, and to use reason to at least analyze them and see what positive and negative aspects they may have based on reason. So I don't think it's a matter of choice, but it's also not a matter of pure reason, is it? A lot of it is tradition, history, family, sociology, culture. Yeah. So difficult.
Did you want to come back on that?
No.
That's okay. Good. Okay, that's, good. Yes.
Slide where you started with worldview at the bottom and you had sort of arrows going up and down between different things. Sorry, I don't know that, but I just wondered if there was any reason why you put them in a certain order, or whether. Because when I looked at it, I thought, gosh, if you really interlinked it, it would just be one big mess. Or is there a reason?
It has to do with particularity. So I mean, you think of a theory as an explanation of a particular set of data in a given discipline, right? There's economic theory, psychological theory, sociological theories, physical theory. Then the paradigm is a collection of theories that guides research, again within a specific discipline. And then I have the academic discipline itself, which I interpret as a tradition of inquiry with a specific focus. And then the broadest of all is worldview. That's the big one. I mean, but the interesting thing to me when I look at science and worldview is a specific discipline is compatible with lots and lots of different worldviews, isn't it? So differing worldviews can fund, interpret, give presuppositions to the same sociology, the same economics. But still, I think that a worldview still is going to influence the way people do their economics, the way they do their sociology, the way they do their art history. I think there's bound to be some shaping going on there. So that's why the arrows go up and down. So it has to do with particularity, with a greater particularity.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I've always been very interested in epistemology, and I think one of the major issues is, well, for the very definition of knowledge, just to start with, truth conditions, for instance, in like one definition of knowledge as justified true belief. Like, you could even say that the whole problem with a definition like that is in what true belief is, well, justification and true conditions. But in this particular case, when you say that theology is truth seeking, what would you say are the truth conditions for instance for theology? What are the truth conditions that would make, I don't know, a theological proposition truth when they are never empirically there is no empirical evidence for that. And sorry, and taking it furthermore, when
maybe I could just answer one question.
Okay.
Maybe the furthermore will lead furthermore. But first of all, I define epistemology as the study of the nature and limits of human reason. So not just the nature of human reason. And when you talk about justified or warranted true belief, you're usually only talking about propositional truth. So the first thing I want to say, and this is a plug for my latest book, which is called Is It All True? The Bible and the Question of Truth, which is edited and has lots of different things about what do we mean when we say the Bible is true, and what is truth in the world of revelation and religion. But my own theory of truth is called the disclosure theory of truth. And that is that truth is the mediated disclosure of being, or if you like, reality. We use Professor Trigg for reality. So truth is not reality. It's not the same thing as reality. It's always mediated to the mind through some structure, through something created. Language is one, but I would say art is another one too. So I don't limit truth to propositions. Okay. Now let's talk just about, but certainly there's propositional truth. So when you talk about the truth of sentences, and not all sentences are propositions, right? I mean, you agree with that, but let's just say those sentences which are propositions. Those, it does seem to me, it's to talk about warranted true belief as being a pretty good definition of knowing with respect to propositions. So, and I would just go back into that slide where I talked about why theology is not a science, that it appeals to revelation, insight, enlightenment that goes beyond the empirical. That does not mean that those are not testable by reason, or that you can't give good arguments based on those assumptions about the sources of spiritual insight and wisdom. We had an earlier question about the doctrine of the Trinity, okay? The doctrine of the Trinity is not directly taught in the Bible, Old or New Testament, right? But it is a legitimate development of biblical ideas that are already present. And so when the early Christians argued about this doctrine, they always appealed to the scriptures and to the worship of the church. In other words, the worshiping practices of the church, in which, among other things, Christians worship Jesus Christ as God, and yet Christians as Jews were monotheists. So making sense of all of the scriptures and the worship traditions, this was their justification. This was their warrant. This was the reasoning. So to understand the rationality of Christian theology, you have to enter into the spirituality and the sources of insight and enlightenment that are unique to that religion, where you can't understand the source of warrant for these propositions.
Well, may I just...
I'd like to follow that. Wouldn't that be advocating for some sort of relativism by enclosing the true conditions of theological proposition to, let's say, its context or its cultural context? And
that's true anyway, even in physics.
Well, I'll be talking about both. I think it's.
You have to understand an awful lot to know that when this meter jiggles like this, it means that theory is right and that theory is wrong.
Well,
it's very socially, culturally contextual. It doesn't lead to relativism that I can see anyway.
Well, if in the context, for instance, of religious pluralism, how do you, what would you say about, for instance, contradictory propositions?
Oh, well, if they're genuine, first of all, it's very hard to demonstrate that the propositions are logically contradictory. And there's been some wonderful work on this in comparative philosophy of religion. And you can get there, but it turns out to be a lot tougher than you might suspect in the beginning. But obviously, a pair of propositions that are contradictory can't both be true. I'll give you that. But that doesn't tell you which one is.
Right, and what would be the truth conditions to evaluating such statements in a more general context?
What would be the truth condition?
Yeah, see, how do you address that contradiction? If you say, okay, the truth conditions come from the context, from where the proposition comes, right? But you have two propositions from, let's say, different contexts.
Our knowledge of the truth of the proposition, that they are true, is dependent on the epistemological context of discovery. Or you can't read the data, you can't understand the evidence if you don't understand the context. So let's take two propositions that are contradictory. I mean, one says everything is nothingness, the gods are phenomena, and the other one says God, there is a single being, God, that's the ultimate reality. Those end up being contradictory. It's very hard to find contradictory doctrines in the great world religions, as William Christensen has argued, I think, very well. One of those is true. Well, maybe both of those are false, right? But they can't both be true. And now the question is, how do you know which one is true? Well, you're going to have to do a lot of philosophy. You're going to have to compare whole world views, because those propositions don't exist in isolation. They exist as part of a whole tradition, a whole metaphysic, a whole way of life. And only when you know which of those you find more adequate in general are you then going to know which of those propositions you believe to be true and which one you believe to be true.
Right. So in other words, the criteria would be the adequacy of the entire worldview that sustains the statement.
No, I think the criterion of truth is just what it says is the case for a proposition.
So in this case, you say
if the ultimate reality is nothingness, that's true just in case ultimate reality is nothingness. Otherwise, it's false. Now, you're asking an epistemological question. How do I know, or on what basis can I warrant that truth? And that is where you go then to these larger issues of having to look at a whole way of life, that truth, that proposition is embedded in that way of life. But I still think that you can compare those on the grounds of reason.
I think we'll take one more. I mean, tea is sort of beckoning, you know, and
Especially in English.
well, you know, tea time is approaching. But is this on the same discussion? Because
Yes, it's just a short comment.
please, yes,
Good.
do, yes, yes.
Good. All right, I'll say that.
You say that these two statements are contradictory.
They end up being contradictory if you understand them in a certain way.
Yeah, this is what I mean as well. But
Yes.
I mean, it depends on what you put in those words.
That's exactly
I
right.
would say that my interpretation of those is the two complementary descriptions of the same thing.
See, that's what I was trying to say. It's very hard to
But this is my
find
interpretation.
exactly two propositions because so much depends on how you interpret those, and then that gets you into this whole larger realm. So I agree with you. Finding logical contradiction is not easy.
Excellent. Now, tea is not only beckoning, it's actually arrived. So I think we will break for tea. And thank you, Alan. And we're looking forward to, we've got another hour and a half for you.
Oh, my Lord.
We're working really hard this afternoon. So
Saints
we'll break
preserve
until
us.
4 o'clock. And yeah, Alan, thanks very much.